Kathleen and Michael Peterson were spending a very peaceful, quiet evening in their large home in Durham, North Carolina. They had spent the evening sipping wine while watching a movie, and then they moseyed out to their pool area where they continued to chat and drink into the night. Kathleen decided to go into the house first because she had a meeting in the morning, so she wanted to get some rest. But Michael, he stayed out by the pool thinking about his next great novel. When he finally did decide to come back into the house, he found a scene he definitely wasn't expecting. He found his wife, Kathleen, at the bottom of the stairs in a pool of her own blood. He frantically called 911 around 2:40 a.m. on December 9th of 2001, saying that his wife had fallen down about 15 to 20 stairs and that he needed help immediately. This one night would shake the entire foundation of the Peterson family for years to come. Let's talk about the convoluted staircase murder. Hi friends, welcome back to the channel. My name is Sydney, and if you're new here, this is just a place where we can talk about true crime, spooky, scary stories, dark history, or anything else I got going on in my brain. If you are into true crime, much like I am, then I'm sure that you've heard about the staircase murder, and we are gonna dive deep into it today. I know a lot of people have very strong opinions about this case, and I do myself, but I'm going to try to keep things as non-biased as possible until we get to the end. A lot of my sources for this case came from newspaper articles from the area at that time as the case was developing. But I did also take some time to watch the Netflix documentary, The Staircase. And of course, if you're familiar with this documentary, then you know that Michael Peterson and his family actually helped produce the documentary. So it is very biased towards the side of Michael, but it does have some really good information, some background scenes from the trial, and so I did want to watch that, and I did take some information from that documentary as well. But without any further ado, let's talk about Kathleen and Michael Peterson. Kathleen Atwater Peterson was born in North Carolina, but then she and her family moved to Pennsylvania, which is where she spent most of her time growing up. After high school, she did earn her bachelor's and master's degree in engineering from Duke University. In her adult years, she was well known for being an advocate and raising money for the North Carolina Ballet and also the American Dance Festival. At the time of Kathleen's death, she was working as an executive for a telecommunications company called Nortel. Michael Peterson was an ex-military man. He served in the Vietnam War as a Marine, and over his time in service, he received a Bronze and Silver Star with Valor, as well as 2 Purple Hearts, one of them being for a time when one of his comrades stepped on a landmine and he was hit with the shrapnel and injured. It would later be discovered, though, during his unsuccessful mayoral campaign, that he didn't earn any of these medals except for 1 Purple Heart, and he received it because he was injured in a car accident when he was in active duty in Japan. But because of these injuries, Michael was honorably discharged in 1971. He later became a relatively successful military fiction author and also wrote articles for the local newspaper, the Herald Sun. And in these articles, he often openly criticized the local police force for their inability to solve crime. Kathleen and Michael met around 1968 when Michael's 2 daughters, Martha and Margaret, and Kathleen's daughter, Caitlin, became neighborhood friends. And so through this childhood friendship, Kathleen and Michael got to talking, and it eventually formed into a relationship. As the relationship grew stronger, Michael and Kathleen decided to move into their $1.2 million home in Durham, North Carolina. And there they created this beautiful blended family with Michael's 4 children, Clayton, Todd, Margaret, and Martha, and Kathleen's daughter, Caitlin. The couple officially got married in 1997, and from all accounts, they had a very beautiful, happy family. Michael and Kathleen had a great relationship. They joked around, they traveled together, they enjoyed life together, and then all of the children were part of this too. So they often had these big family dinners. They would tell each other everything, and from just all accounts, from an outsider's perspective at least, it looked like a very successful blended family. So on the night of December 9th, 2001, authorities arrived on the scene, and before even entering the home, they found that there was blood on the walkway leading up to the front door, and they also found blood on the front door. They didn't have to do much to actually enter the home, as the front door was wide open, but as they slowly walked towards the scene, they noticed that there was blood everywhere, like a ton of blood all over the place. Kathleen was positioned at the bottom of the stairs with the lower half of her body sticking out from the end of the staircase. There was a towel found underneath Kathleen's head that was completely soaked with blood, and there were also paper towels around her body. It looked like somebody had tried to start cleaning up but just gave up. The police noted as well that there was blood spatter all over the walls of the staircases, sometimes reaching heights of about 10 feet. It was a surprising amount of blood for a fall case. There was also a bloody footprint found on the back of Kathleen's leg, and this footprint was belonging to Michael Peterson. Further testing did show that there were footprints leading away from Kathleen's body to both the kitchen and the laundry room. And a paramedic that responded to the scene said that this was way more blood than he had ever seen at any other fall case that he had attended. The toxicology reports came back, and it showed that Kathleen had a blood alcohol level of 0.07, which is just under the legal limit. But Michael also stated that Kathleen had most likely taken a Valium before she went upstairs. The autopsy report came back, and it stated that Kathleen had these very small cuts and bruises all over the upper half of her body, her face, around her eyes and on her nose, her hands, her arms. Everything seemed to be kind of covered in these small cuts and bruises. She was found with her own hair grasped in her hands, and she had blood underneath her fingernails. There was damage found to her thyroid cartilage, which is very consistent with strangulation, although nothing else really pointed to a strangulation death. But probably the most striking piece of evidence from her autopsy report was that Kathleen had 7 3-inch long lacerations in the back of her head. The official cause of death was stated to be due to blood loss, but in the notes it stated that Kathleen most likely had some kind of blunt force trauma that led her to bleed out for almost 90 minutes before she actually passed away. So as the autopsy is coming back and more evidence is being gathered, authorities are very suspicious of Michael Peterson. There's way too much blood to be a fall case, in their opinion, and there's just too many weird circumstances happening, and so they focus all of their attention on Michael Peterson. He was the last one to see Kathleen. He found her body. His 911 call was a little bit suspicious.
No, she's not conscious.
Okay, how many stairs did he fall down?
Huh?
How many stairs?
Stairs!
How many stairs? Calm down, sir. Calm down.
No, 15, 20, I don't know. Please, get somebody here right away, please.
Okay,
So in the days following Kathleen's death, everybody was fully supportive of Michael. They were like, they had such a loving relationship. There's no way that Michael killed Kathleen. They were like, it's preposterous. She just fell down the stairs. But slowly, as evidence started coming in and as the public, they were able to see some of the autopsy pictures, some of the family members turned their back on Michael. Both of Kathleen's sisters and Kathleen's daughter, Caitlin, they started to believe that Michael killed Kathleen, just by the nature of the injuries that were sustained during her death. It just didn't add up to these family members. They strongly believed that Michael should be held responsible for Kathleen's death, and this all came to fruition as Michael was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Kathleen Peterson on December 20th of 2001. A little under a month later, in January of 2002, Michael was able to post bail and was released from the Durham County Jail. And now Michael can focus on his defense outside of jail. And so as he is gathering his evidence, trying to find a team, in October of 2002, Caitlin actually files a wrongful death suit against Michael Peterson. A 12-member jury was picked out in May of 2003, and then on July 1st, the trial began. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Jim Hardin, opened up the case by arguing that Michael Peterson killed Kathleen and even speculated a murder weapon for the crime, which was a blowpoke. If you are not hoity-toity and if you don't have a fireplace, like I don't, a blowpoke is basically like a long metal tube and it's hollow, so you can like blow through it. And there's also like a pointy end, so you can like stoke your fire with the pointy end and then blow onto the fire to like stoke it, basically. Hardin argued that a weapon like a blowpoke would be the perfect weapon and could definitely cause the injuries and the lacerations found on Kathleen's head. This alleged murder weapon, though, this blowpoke, had evidently been lost. Authorities couldn't find it when they originally searched the house. And so this was kind of a red flag, like, oh, Michael killed Kathleen with a blowpoke and then disposed of it, and now the police can't find it. And there were a number of motives, according to Hardin. One being that the Petersons had a taste for the finer things, but they were also in some debt, about $143,000 worth of debt. And on top of that, the company that Kathleen was working for, Nortel, they were going through some financial troubles, and Kathleen was kind of nervous that she was going to get laid off. And as you'll remember, Michael Peterson was an author, so it's not like a very stable, continuous income. So, I mean, there would be a pretty hefty life insurance policy payout for Kathleen's death. And that was definitely a motive. It was there. The defense, led by legendary lawyer David Rudolph, obviously wanted the jury to believe that Kathleen had died by falling down the stairs in some kind of freak accident. In his opening statements, he immediately countered the argument that Kathleen was killed by a blowpoke, saying that there's no way that Kathleen's injuries could be sustained with a weapon of this caliber. David also focused very heavily on the relationship between Kathleen and Michael. All of the friends and family that had been initially interviewed had nothing bad to say about the Petersons' relationship. It was a happy and loving one, and David really wanted that to come across to the jury. So now, with the stage set, both sides had a chance to present their evidence and make their case. About a month into the trial, on August 11 of 2003, a man named Brent Wolgamont took the stand and stated that he and Michael Peterson had been chatting online before Kathleen's death and were possibly planning to meet up for some sexy times. However, this meeting never transpired. It was nothing more than conversations and pictures. And before the trial had even begun, David Rudolph attempted to get this evidence excluded from the trial for a number of reasons. For one, exposing Michael's sexual preferences could have definitely swayed a jury, especially in the early 2000s when it was still kind of a taboo subject. And secondly, showing that Michael was having an extramarital affair was definitely not a good look, even if it was with a man. Like, kind of disproves the theory that they had this happy, nice relationship. But of course, his evidence was allowed because having this extramarital affair could definitely be another motive for Michael killing Kathleen. The prosecution explained that Kathleen never knew that Michael was having these conversations and that they had never talked about him having these feelings for men. The prosecution presented the jury with a theory that Kathleen might have found out that Michael was having these conversations with Brent, confronted Michael might have gotten angry and killed Kathleen because of it. Michael, however, always insisted from the time this evidence came out to present day that there was kind of an unspoken understanding that Michael was having these feelings, and Kathleen kind of knew about it without them actually having a formal conversation about it. And Michael also stated that it was in no way an emotional affair. Everything that he did with men was simply about the act of sex. And it's kind of funny too, because on the stand, Brent was like, yeah, it was weird because Michael talked about Kathleen openly in their conversations. He talked about how much he loved her, how great their marriage was, and obviously a lot of the men that he spoke to were also married men, but they never talked about their wives. So that was something kind of interesting that did help the defense in a way. The following week, on August 18th, Dwayne Deaver, who was a blood spatter expert for the State Bureau of Investigation, testified that based on the evidence and the photographs that he had seen, he believed that Michael killed Kathleen by beating her to death. He explained to the jury his process of taking all of the evidence and creating these experiments to try to recreate the blood spatter patterns from that night. At the time, the court and jury took all of this testimony as truth, not really considering the way that Dwayne Deaver conducted his experiments might not really be good science. Most blood spatter analysts try to recreate the scene in the most realistic way possible, and then they conduct their experiments and see if they get blood spatter patterns similar to the ones found at the scene of the crime. But the way Dwayne Deaver conducted his experiments for this case was that he did whatever he could, any way possible, to recreate the exact blood spatter patterns found at the scene of the crime. And it's interesting because when you think about good science, you don't care about the end result. The end result is a moot point. You care about the steps you take to get there. And that is what good science is. You care about each step of the process leading to whatever your end product might be. But a bad scientist will only care about the end result and will do whatever it takes to get there. And that's exactly what Duane Deaver did. I'm gonna try to find some footage from these experiments because it's almost laughable. Like, Duane is standing in like the most awkward position trying to like beat this styrofoam head, and it looks so unnatural. A person would never try to kill somebody else in such an awkward way, but that's the way Duane conducted his experiments. In September of 2001, the defense had their own blood spatter analyst named Henry Lee look at all the evidence and the photos, and he concluded that the blood spatter patterns were most consistent with a falling death. His theory was that Kathleen most likely fell on the second or third step and then smacked her head against the wall. And he concluded this because there was a lot of blood spatter right at 62 inches, which would have been Kathleen's height. Lee also concluded that the other spatters found around the scene were consistent with her trying to like lift herself back up, but then like slipping around in the blood and falling again and again, which would of course create more blood spatter. There were also some smaller spatters that would be consistent with like somebody coughing up blood and it spraying all over the walls. Probably though the most important evidence that Henry Lee didn't see was that he didn't see any cast-off patterns at all at the scene of the crime. And if you don't know, a cast-off pattern happens when you are beating somebody to death, and so when you take your object and you hit something, you pull it back, there's going to be blood on the object and it's going to spray back onto the walls and onto the ceiling. But there was none of that found at the scene of the crime. So Henry Lee truly believed in his expert, blood spattery way that Kathleen died from a fall. Now things take another wild turn in late August as the prosecution has a bombshell that they're about to drop onto the jury. But before we get into what that evidence is, let's talk about Michael Peterson's time in Germany. It was 1985 and Michael was living with his first wife, Patty, when something almost uncanny happened. The couple went over to have dinner at a mutual friend's home, and her name was Elizabeth Radliff. And after dinner, Patty decided to go back to the Peterson home, but Michael stayed to help put Elizabeth's children, Margaret and Martha, to bed. Fast forward to the next morning, Elizabeth's nanny found her dead at the bottom of her staircase. Now this is kind of interesting to me, but in Germany, a doctor always comes to the scene of a crime or the scene of a death and decides the cause of death right then and there. So the doctor at the scene decided that Elizabeth had passed away from a spontaneous intracranial hemorrhage, and this happened as she was walking up the stairs, and so she fell and died. And this did make a good bit of sense because Elizabeth had been suffering from these horrible migraines before her death, and she actually had a doctor's appointment scheduled to try to get this issue taken care of, but she did pass away before she could go. Some of the witnesses who were at the scene of Elizabeth's death stated that there was blood everywhere, all over the walls, all over Elizabeth, everywhere. But other people said that there was no blood at all at the scene of the crime. So that's something that has always been disputed. Life went on, and Patty and Michael actually adopted Margaret and Martha, and they eventually moved back to the United States. And now, almost 20 years later, Kathleen Peterson was found in a much similar circumstance at the bottom of the stairs, and with both women, Michael was the last person to see them alive. So after the prosecution discovered this weird situation in April of 2003, they obviously decided that they wanted this situation to be entered in as evidence. So Elizabeth's body was actually exhumed from its resting spot in Texas, transported 1,200 miles to Durham, North Carolina, where the medical examiner that did Kathleen's autopsy could perform a second autopsy on Elizabeth Radliff. And can you even imagine how Margaret and Martha must be feeling? First, they lose their stepmom. Then they lose their dad because now he is caught up in this trial. His name has been slandered all over the media, and he has the potential of going to jail for the rest of his life. And now their mom, who they had laid to rest 16 years ago, is getting exhumed, and so all of this old trauma is now being redug up, literally, and presented in front of their faces in court. Like, can you even imagine? And these girls are only like in their 20s at this point. But I mean, the girls did have a say in whether or not their mom's body would be exhumed, and they agreed to it only because they thought it could actually help their father's case. After examining the body, the medical examiner changed Elizabeth's cause of death to homicidal assault. And again, let me remind you, it's kind of strange because the doctor at the scene of the crime, as well as the pathologist that originally did her autopsy, both concluded that Elizabeth had died from a hemorrhage and had fallen down the stairs. And now it had been changed to homicidal assault. It was just a little bit odd. This obviously was devastating to Michael, Margaret, Martha, and the defense because this would obviously sway the jury in a huge way. The prosecution obviously presented this evidence during the trial and also had Elizabeth's nanny as well as a few of Elizabeth's friends that were at the scene of the crime testify, and they all said that they witnessed a lot of blood at the scene of the crime. Probably the most surprising turn of events happened near the very end of the trial in late September when David presented to the court the alleged missing murder weapon, the blowpoke. As you remember, this blowpoke was allegedly not found when authorities first searched the house, but then Clayton, one of Michael's sons, was just like fucking around in their basement and he found the blowpoke. And it looked like it hadn't been moved in a long time, well over 6 months. It was like covered in cobwebs and dust. And so when presented to the court, the prosecution, they were obviously very surprised, but they came back with a rebuttal stating that they just thought that Michael murdered Kathleen with something like a blowpoke. That probably wasn't the murder weapon, but it was probably something like a blowpoke. So it's like, why even include that if you're not sure what the murder weapon? I don't know. I've lots of opinions on both sides, lots of criticisms on both sides, but we'd be here for literally hours if we tried to dig into all of it. The defense struggled deciding if they even wanted to include the blowpoke as evidence because this could be seen as being kind of like sneaky. They were trying to like sneak evidence in right before the trial ended, and so they were unsure if this would help or hurt their case. After a whopping 3-month trial, the jury spent 5 days deliberating before they came back with their verdict. So on October 10th of 2003, the jury decided that Michael Peterson was guilty of the first-degree murder of Kathleen Peterson, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This was obviously devastating to Michael because this was his life, but also Clayton, Todd, Margaret, and Martha were devastated as well. They believed in their heart that with all of the evidence that was brought forward, that a jury could not find their dad guilty, but yet here they were, now faced with this problem of losing their dad for his entire life and him having to go to prison. And of course, the defense team, especially David Rudolph, took this loss very hard because he had put years into this case. He had tried his hardest to defend Michael Peterson, and it was basically all for nothing. But this is not the end of the relationship for David Rudolph and Michael Peterson. David immediately appeals this conviction and starts working on their appeal. So time passes and Michael is getting used to being in prison, and he starts writing letters back and forth to one of the editors that worked on the Staircase documentary. She was a French woman named Sophie Burnett, and they didn't speak to each other at all during the first part of the production of the Staircase, but they got to know each other afterwards, and they continually sent letters back and forth to each other, and it eventually blossomed into a long-distance relationship while Michael was in prison. So fast forward quite a bit to 2008, Caitlin is awarded $25 million in that wrongful death lawsuit. Throughout this entire time, from 2003 to 2008, David and his team are continually trying to get an appeal, but they are denied every single time. But that's when something incredible happens. A newspaper uncovered some very sketchy practices from the State Bureau of Investigation and, most notably, Duane fucking Deaver. Because of this expose, the district attorney's office decided to launch an investigation to look into all of these unjust practices, and they found that Duane Deaver had mishandled a lot of cases, including Michael Peterson's. The main problem was that Duane Deaver would conduct all of these lab tests, but he would not report out negative results. And again, not good science. A good scientist is not biased. They don't take sides, but yet he would give the prosecution all of the evidence that would support their case, but wouldn't give the defense negative test results that would definitely help the defense's case. So because of this, the judge from the original trial, Judge Hudson, he finally granted Michael Peterson an appeal. The hearing started on December 6th of 2011, and the defense's main goal in this hearing was to prove that the evidence Duane Deaver gave to the court in his original testimony swayed the opinion of the jury. During this hearing, a blood spatter expert that had co-authored a bunch of books on the subject of blood spatter analysis came onto the stand and basically said that everything Duane Deaver did for Michael Peterson's case was wrong, like just dead wrong, not good science. In the original trial, Duane Deaver claimed to have written reports and worked on over 200 cases, and the defense wanted to fact check this for this hearing, so they went through literally all of Deaver's reports, and what they found was very interesting. Turns out Deaver had only ever been to 17 different crime scenes, helped write reports for 34 different cases, and had only done experiments like the ones he did for Michael Peterson's case 3 times. Yeah, 3 times. Deaver also said on the stand that he had worked on about 15 different fall cases, but after going through all of the reports that Deaver had written and been a part of, he had never worked on a single fall case in his entire career. So because of all this, Judge Hudson grants Michael Peterson the right to a new trial, and the next day, he is released from prison after being in there for almost 8 years. He's released on a $300,000 bond and is confined to his house. He's on house arrest and is wearing like an ankle monitor. So at this point, Michael and David are like, we don't really know if we want to go through this horrific process again and try to have an entirely new trial. So in October of 2014, Michael attempts to take an Alford plea, which basically states, yeah, there's a lot of evidence. The evidence is there. I can see how you would want to say that I'm guilty, but I'm not. The evidence is there, but I'm not pleading guilty. That's what an Alford plea is. So Michael attempts to take this Alford plea, but the district attorney is like, no, I have to go with the wishes of Kathleen's family, and they do not want you to take the Alford plea, which basically meant that Michael had to go back and have a new trial. There was no other way. If it wasn't going to be settled out of court, it had to be settled with a trial. And unfortunately, David Rudolph was like, listen, man, I cannot do this whole retrial again. Like, I will help you. I will be your wingman, whatever, but like, I cannot be your lead attorney anymore. So David actually got another very awesome defense lawyer, powerhouse attorney named Mike Klingesum to help Michael with his new trial. And this is probably for the best because with a fresh set of eyes on the evidence, a lot of new things were uncovered. For one, they discovered that all of the evidence that had been collected and put into bags had been contaminated. Like, they found the evidence bags ripped open, and who knows like when that happened. It could have been 2 days ago, could have been in 2001. The bags were ripped open. Not only that, but there were pieces of evidence from other cases mixed in with this case's evidence. And it was like, what the fuck? Like, this is all bad evidence now. We can't retest it. We can't use it. It's all contaminated. It was also discovered that Kathleen's clothing that she was wearing when she died had never actually been tested for DNA evidence. In fact, somebody from Duane Deaver's team changed the paperwork to say that the clothing should go to Deaver first before going to DNA testing, which was not a very common practice, and then it just never got tested. Again, now this evidence can't be tested because who knows how many people have touched Kathleen's clothing, how just the weather and the environment have affected the way that her clothing look, the way that it feels. The test results are going to not be accurate. So with all of this new evidence, the defense again went back to Judge Hudson and they were like, hey, please dismiss these charges because Michael Peterson never got a fair trial. Because of all this Duane Deaver stuff, because Kathleen's clothes were never tested for DNA, because the evidence wasn't even stored correctly, like, he never had a fair chance. And this defense team was really, really hopeful that the charges would be dismissed. But Judge Hudson denied the request again, and so they were back to square one. They started preparing for a retrial. But in a somewhat surprising turn of events in 2017, the DA came to Michael's team and said, hey, we're going to allow you to take the Alford plea if you want. David Rudolph actually had this theory that the prosecution decided that Michael could take the Alford plea because a lot of the evidence that was used in the original trial probably wouldn't be allowed in this retrial. And so the chances of the prosecution winning were very, very slim at this point. Michael did take some time thinking about whether or not he wanted to take this plea because remember, the Alford plea says that there's enough evidence to prove that I'm guilty. I'm not saying I am, but there's enough evidence. Whereas if he went to retrial, he would have the chance to be, in the eyes of the law, an innocent man. But by this point, Michael was in his 70s, and he really didn't want to put his children through the turmoil of another trial. So Michael did agree to take this Alford plea, and he pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. During this plea hearing, Kathleen's sisters both had a chance to speak, and you could tell that there was a lot of sadness, obviously, still for the loss of their sister, but they also still had a very deep-seated hatred for Michael Peterson, and especially Kathleen's sister, Candace. She seemed very, very upset, not only at Michael, but at David Rudolph, and it just made me kind of sad to listen to it because you can tell that she is still like stuck in 2001 almost. She is just reeling over the loss of her sister. Candace also took this opportunity to give a shout out to the film crew of The Staircase, saying that they never asked for her or her family's consent to be in the documentary or to have Kathleen's story documented for the entire world to see. Michael was sentenced to time served, and after almost 20 years, he was officially a free man. He was still guilty in the eyes of the law and the eyes of the justice system, but he was finally free from all of the media, all of the press, all of this court and trial stuff. He was free. Judge Hudson later stated that he believed Michael Peterson did get a fair trial, although he did agree with the defense that the stuff about Michael's sexuality and the whole Germany Elizabeth Ratliff situation probably shouldn't have been included in as evidence. He did state, though, that a clear-minded juror could have found Michael innocent of the crime. So Michael still lives in Durham, North Carolina, and he has written 2 memoirs, one about his time in prison and one about his life with Kathleen. Sophie did come to the United States multiple times to visit Michael Peterson while they were in a relationship, and at some point Michael was thinking about moving to France to be with Sophie, but their relationship lasted about 13 years and it broke off amicably. Michael stated that he did love Sophie, but he could never love anyone the way that he loved his wife, Kathleen. Before we close off today's case, I do just want to talk a little bit about theories. There are 3 main theories. The first one, obviously, being that Michael Peterson killed Kathleen. There was the unexplained bloody footprint on the back of Kathleen's sweatpants. And then, of course, the hair and the blood found under her nails. She did appear like she was having some kind of struggle when she died. Then, of course, the second theory is that Kathleen did fall down the stairs. The blood spatter evidence does indicate that she fell, hit her head, and then tried to lift herself back up and continued to slip and fall in the blood until she ultimately bled out. And the lacerations could be explained from her, again, hitting her head. That would also make sense because she didn't have a skull fracture, which she would most likely have if somebody beat her to death. And to add to that, Michael Peterson never seemed to have any defensive wounds that you would see on somebody that killed another person. Then there's a third theory that a number of people believe, and this is the owl theory. This theory arose in 2009 when an attorney and friend of the Petersons decided to look over the evidence themselves and came to the conclusion that neither a beating or a fall down the stairs was the cause of death. They believe that Kathleen was attacked by a barred owl while she was walking into the home that night. And before you tune me out, listen to some of this evidence because it kind of makes sense. For one, this type of owl has been known to sometimes be aggressive and dangerous, and barred owls had been spotted in the area around the Peterson home in around the time frame that Kathleen died, in the months leading up to her death. While looking at the autopsy photo, the attorney realized that she had these small feathers stuck in her hair, and she had a twig glued to her sweatpants in dried blood. An owl attack would kind of actually explain why there was blood on the Petersons' walkway leading up to their front door, and on the front door there were smears of blood. This would make sense if Kathleen was getting attacked by an owl and she was trying to defend herself. There would be blood kind of like gushing from her head, and she would be frantically trying to get into the home. I think the most intriguing evidence are the lacerations that were found on Kathleen. They're much more consistent with owl talons than with a blunt object or by falling and hitting your head. The smaller cuts and bruises could also be explained as when owls kind of like latch on and are attacking their prey, they also peck with their beak. The theory states that on December 9th, Kathleen was walking back into the Peterson home when she was attacked by the barred owl, kind of fought it off, attempted to walk up the stairs after the attack was over, and then she fell and passed away. The only person that will truly ever know what happened to Kathleen is Kathleen herself. And sometimes in cases, the evidence talks and tells a story. Other times, it just makes it more confusing. And I think in this case, the evidence makes the case more confusing, makes the case unsolvable, really, when you think about it. Like, there are many theories that are kind of plausible, but there's no one true answer. And depending on who you ask, you're gonna get a different theory. And I think this case has been so sensationalized with the documentary, with this new HBO show, The Staircase, that is coming out currently, I believe. I didn't watch it, but I've heard a lot about it. I think we get lost a lot of the times in Michael Peterson as a person. He's very quirky, he's very odd. Michael's family, they're charismatic, they seem to be very kind people. We get lost in all of the evidence and the trial, and we kind of lose the fact that Kathleen lost her life. Kathleen was a beautiful, smart woman, and she died way too soon. And so I would just like to say my heart goes out to the Peterson and the Atwater family. Although it's been 2 decades at this point, doesn't make it easier. I can't imagine the loss. So my heart goes out to their families. And I guess I'll end off by talking about what I think. When I first heard about this case, I believed that Michael Peterson was guilty, like 100%. No doubt. I was like, this man's guilty as fuck. Well, working on this case and like looking over the evidence more in depth, I don't know. The fact of the matter is that the evidence does look like it's more consistent with a fall. And I feel like the way the case was handled, the way that evidence was handled, was just like criminal, super unjust. And that also makes me think that like the police were involved in some way or the other in making Michael guilty, or like forming the evidence to make Michael guilty. But ultimately, like, now that I'm here and I've looked at this case for almost a month at this point, I don't know anymore. I don't know. Both theories are possible. Hell, the owl theory is possible. I don't know. So I would love to hear in the comments below what are your guys' thoughts on this. But yeah, I really hope that you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe. I appreciate all of the support, and I appreciate you guys being here even with my super inconsistent posting schedule. I'm trying to really take care of my mental health, and so this kind of stuff does unfortunately get put on the back burner sometimes, but I'm very grateful for those of you that stick around. I just love making videos, and I love the research, and I love all of it. So thank you all for coming on this journey with me. Hope you guys are having a lovely summer. Thank you again for watching, and keep being the bad bitches that you are. Bye, guys.